Very good evening to all of you. So this is our webinar of this week. Today, Dr. Sunil Pandya sir with us. Sunil Pandya sir doesn't require any introduction, but he is director at Century Super Speciality Hospital at Hyderabad. He is senior consultant at Department of Anesthesia in Fernandez Hospital. He is founder director of Prerna Anesthesia and Critical Care Services. That is probably a vast group practice concept across India. It started in 1997. Sir is honorary secretary of Association of Obstetric Anesthesia India. Sir is passionate about obstetric critical care and high risk obstetric. Sir's hobby is teaching and training postgraduate students for anesthesia and especially for obstetric and labor analgesia. Recently, I came to know that Sir is fond of playing music also. Sir is invited faculty at many across globe. Sir has many publication and book chapters to his name. Sir is peer reviewer in many journals in India as well as in international journals. So, sir is going to talk to us about obstetric anesthesia, that is HELP and AFLP complex critical overview. So, I hand over to Pandya sir for his presentation. Please, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Hetal. Hope I'm audible to each one of you. At the outset, a very good evening to all who have logged us and watching us live. And I thank Dr. Hetal, my friend from my in-laws place, Rajkot. And also I thank the TAS Society for giving me this opportunity to share my experience on this topic. At the outset, I would like to convey my greetings from Association of Obstetric Anesthesiologists India. And I represent AOA India here when I'm giving this talk, and also greetings from Prerna team and Fernandez Hospital. As you know, Fernandez Hospital, this is an old slide, almost about 5 years old. It's a 320-bed tertiary care referral center, and the annual delivery rate is around 9,000 plus. We have crossed 9,000 plus last year. And we have a dedicated obstetric critical care unit. For the first time, we started a dedicated critical care unit way back in 1998. And if you look at the percentage of regional anesthesia, is almost about 98 to 99% for all electives, and emergencies also about 97%. We have a good support of neonatal intensive care unit, obstetric medicine unit, and as said earlier by Dr. Hetal, we run the obstetric critical care unit also. We have 24/7 on-demand labor epidurals, one of the largest series we have in Southeast Asia. And we run postdoctoral training program in obstetric anesthesia, postdoctoral fellowships, 1 year duration, and also PhD training program. Nil conflict of interest. So before we go into the HELP AFLP complex, let us briefly understand the hypertensive spectrum. If you see the hypertensive disorders in pregnancy, at one end you have preeclampsia without severity, then you have severe preeclampsia with severity features like thrombocytopenia, elevated liver enzymes, or even acute kidney injury, or seizures, or acute pulmonary edema. Sometimes you have hypertensive crisis, and sometimes you have chronic hypertension with superimposed preeclampsia. But importantly, all this, at one end you have preeclampsia without complications, at the other end you have severe preeclampsia, you have eclampsia. Importantly, I want to focus you on this particular the segment of the wheel, the HELP AFLP, hepatic ischemia, infarction and rupture. Well, this is what hypertensive disorder is, and this is what HELP AFLP is. Ultimately, if we don't take care of the patient properly, they eventually go into multi-organ dysfunction syndrome and ends up with mortality. If we review the maternal mortality data of our country, this was this is an old presentation, WHO data. Preeclampsia was the third leading cause, but currently from 2018-2019 onwards, preeclampsia, HELP and AFLP are the leading cause of maternal mortality in our country, mainly hypertensive disorders. So basically, when we discuss about hypertensive disorders, at one end you have preeclampsia without severity, at the other end we have eclampsia, a part of HELP syndrome, and AFLP also is considered as a part of hypertensive spectrum, and we also have hypertensive cardiomyopathy. If you look at the cause of mortality, majority of the cause of hypertensive related deaths are because of neurological complications and intracranial bleeds. Pulmonary complications have been almost reduced to zero. That is again because of the good critical care management by the anesthesiologist and the intensivist. And if you see pulmonary edema and ARDS, virtually the mortality rate is zero. But again, liver involvement, hepatic rupture, hepatic bleed, subcapsular hematomas are the leading cause. And the commonest cause of subcapsular hematomas and bleeds are AFLP and HELP syndrome. This is the data from our ICU. The commonest cause of ICU admission at Fernandez Hospital is the hypertensive disorder, again 48%. And if you look at the spectrum of problems that we have in hypertensive is, I want to focus again on this square where HELP is almost 12.9%. This is just 1 year data, 12.9 and 2% are EFLP. So on an average, we have about 25 to 30 cases of HELP year on year. And to date, we have almost more than 250, 300 cases of HELP syndrome, and 1/4 of them are AFLP. And if you see, these are all the different complications, different spectrums that we have as a part of hypertensive spectrum. It is very important to understand the damage that this disease entity does. If you look at the organ support requirement in this entity, the renal replacement therapy, if you see, has been zero. That is because again of judicious management of fluid and invasive hemodynamic monitoring. But 12% of the patients they require ventilator support because of pulmonary edema, ARDS, or any other cause. And importantly, if you look at the incidence of massive obstetric hemorrhage, these again the data from our hospital, 15% of the patients who require who have major obstetric hemorrhage and massive transfusion, they belong to HELP AFLP category. But the beauty of this disease entity is they are completely reversible. They are very life-threatening. The mortality and morbidity is very high. But if you give a right intervention and the right proactive approach and aggressive approach, the mortality can be reduced to almost 0%. So coming to again today's topic, what is HELP syndrome? HELP syndrome was defined by Louis Weinstein in 1982. It's a triad of hemolysis, elevated liver enzymes, and low platelets. And any of those two criteria from hemolysis, like presence of fragmented RBCs or schistocytes and Burr cells, or reduction of haptoglobulin, which indicates hemolysis, or significant drop in hemoglobin level, they again because of hemolysis, or elevation liver enzymes like SGOT, SGPT, AST, ALT are elevated. LDH, which again is a marker of liver injury or hemolysis, is grossly elevated, and thrombocytopenia. Again, there are several classifications of HELP. I'll take you through the very well-known classification, CBI. Baha M. CBI, he has done probably one of the pioneer in HELP and AFLP. A lot of research has been done, and even a lot of references and quotation, studies I'll be quoting are from his studies, CBI's criteria and our own experience. So according to CBI's criteria, hemolysis, which is in India, indirect bilirubin of more than 1.2, LDH more than 600 units, elevate SGOT, SGPT double the baseline. That is generally we consider 35 as most of the labs, 30, 35, but anything more than 40 is considered day range, and double that it comes under the HELP category, and thrombocytopenia of less than a lakh. Again, there is a Tennessee system of classification of HELP syndrome, which is complete and incomplete syndrome. Any of these, two of this complete and one of the this criteria can be considered as HELP syndrome, like elevated liver enzymes, thrombocytopenia, LDH, AST, and ALT. Again, the Mississippi classification is a 3-class system which we all follow, and it's internationally renowned, and many of the complications and outcome of maternal and neonatal outcomes are done. They are based on this classification, Mississippi classification, where this is HELP is classified into class 1, 2, and 3. 1 is the severe category, platelets are less than 50,000. 2 is platelets between 50 to 1 lakh, and class 3 is platelet count is more than lakh, that is up to 1.5 lakh. Plus AST, ALT, that is SGOT, SGPT and SGOT more than 70 units internal unit per liter, and LDH of more than 600 units per liter. Again, SGOT, SGPT, LDH values varies from lab to lab, but what they say is LDH double the baseline from the lab is considered as significant. It is very important to know the class of HELP syndrome because the mortality, the morbidity of maternal and neonatal outcome depends on the class. So always better that we catch HELP syndrome in class 3. And whenever the patient is in class 3 of HELP syndrome, where the platelet count is more than 1 lakh, the morbidity mortality is very low. And this is where the biochemical diagnosis happens. The patient may not have any clinical symptoms like hematuria or oliguria or any of the seizures or any of the symptoms. But if you look at the laboratory parameters, they have these criteria which I have mentioned, like elevated liver enzymes, low platelets, and LDH. So biochemical diagnosis, if you see and if you monitor closely, you can prevent the progression of patient from class 3 to class 1, which ends up with a mortality of almost 1.6 to 1.2%, 1.8%. So recently, again, this was a paper that was edited by Baha M. Sibai in as recent as May 2020, and they have categorized or they have defined HELP syndrome separately from preeclampsia. What they say is 20% of HELP syndrome do not have antecedent hypertension and proteinuria. So basically, you have these elevated liver enzymes, you have hemolysis, you have low platelets in the absence of hypertension. And the incidence, overall incidence of HELP syndrome is about 2 to 3% of all hypertensive spectrum. And when you look at the pathophysiology of HELP syndrome, basically 70% they have underlying hypertensive disorders, but 30% may not have underlying hypertension, as I said earlier. But importantly, at some point of time, it diverges itself into the different pathway from what the preeclampsia pathway is, and you end up with the patient ends up with greater hepatic inflammation, greater activation of coagulation system than in preeclampsia. So basically, the involvement of liver, involvement of coagulation system, and also the kidneys are fulminant in a chunk of HELP syndrome, and that's how they say that probably it is an independent entity, and it also comes under the thrombotic microangiopathy classification, and it's like basically it's considered as a dysregulation of complement pathway. Why this complement thing came into picture is there was a beautiful study that was done in about few years ago, where the authors have used this C5 complement protein target inhibitor, it's a monoclonal antibody, eculizumab, which has halted the progress of HELP syndrome. So when the patient was put on eculizumab, the HELP syndrome progression was stopped. They could stop the progression of HELP syndrome. Patient improved clinically, and the patient completely had normal parameters. And again, when the medication of eculizumab was stopped, patient again developed progression to HELP syndrome. So basically, this shows that complement system also is activated. So basically, it's an inflammatory system, cytokine storm, whatever you call, but this is what HELP is. Coming to AFLP, acute fatty liver of pregnancy, also is an obstetric emergency characterized by maternal liver dysfunction or failure that can lead to maternal and fetal demise, complications including death. And it's relatively rarer complication compared to HELP syndrome, 1 in 7,000 to 1 in 18,000 pregnancies. But importantly, it is associated with fatty acid oxidase dehydrogenase deficiency, basically. So if you see 50% of the patients who have AFLP, they have LCHAT deficiency, long hydroxyacid dehydrogenase deficiency. Basically, it's a E474Q mutation genetically, and most of these patients, they have this fetuses, they have this deficiency. So the fatty acid load in the fetal circulation increases, which comes to the maternal circulation, and this excessive fatty acid, which are not metabolized in the fetus, they get deposited into the maternal liver and can causes severe hepatic dysfunction and fulminant hepatic failure also. So predominantly, it is associated with male fetuses, and it can be a part of preeclampsia and HELP syndrome. And again, this is a paper that has come recently. So AFLP is considered as a part of preeclampsia HELP entity, and it is common in multiparity. Whereas severe preeclampsia is more common in nulliparous, HELP syndrome is usually seen in multiparous, but AFLP generally is seen again in multiparous. As I said, it alters the amino acid at 474 part of the protein sequencing. That glutamic acid is changed, replaced by glutamine, and this is what the mutation leads to: a deficiency of LCHAT, and you do see depositions of fatty acid in the liver. In addition to LCHAT deficiency, AFLP, there are other medium chain, short chain, carnitine transferase deficiencies and mitochondrial transfunction protein deficiencies are also seen, but these are smaller chunk. So 50% of AFLP is because of LCHAT, and predominantly that's what we have analyzed, and we have had quite a few cases where we have done genetic studies and we could find out the deficiencies. And when we followed up subsequent pregnancies, because the Fernandez Hospital is almost about 80-year-old organization, and we get patients from generations. So this patient, when they came for second pregnancy, we followed up closely with lefties, and we could see patients going back into AFLP with a previous history. So E474 mutation studies are important whenever you have a patient with HELP AFLP. So what is the similarity between HELP AFLP? Again, as I said, this mutation of E474Q or G1528C mutation, but basically this is the mutation and there is a change in amino acid 474th amino acid in the protein, is also associated with HELP preeclampsia and with several phenotypic features of AFLP. So basically this mutation also mimics HELP and preeclampsia. So it is again considered as a part of HELP AFLP complex. And these are all the studies. Of course, the studies are relatively not new, but there are a lot of papers, but these are the important papers which says that it is a part of FAOD deficiency syndrome. Again, 2% of HELP syndrome, they have LChat deficiency. So predominantly patients who have diagnosed HELP syndrome, they have LChat deficiency. So again, LChat deficiency is a sign which we see in AFLP, but again, there is a significant overlap with HELP. So there are significant series of HELP, predominantly HELP series. In one of the series, 6 pregnancies with fetal LChat deficiency developed severe HELP syndrome and AFLP. So basically, when the fetuses had this deficiency, maternal HELP syndrome was very common. And this was one of the largest series where they had 19 fetuses, they had identified LChat deficiency, and 15 mothers, 79% developed AFLP or HELP syndrome during their pregnancies. And these are all the studies. These are little older studies, but again, they are the hallmark research studies which came in Lancet and New England Journal of Medicine. So basically, HELP AFLP, there is a significant clinical and laboratory overlap. So you have symptomatology that is same, laboratory findings more or less are same. Histopathology finding are different, where we predominantly you have a fatty acid deposition in liver. You have a fatty liver with Sudano stain, which is very classic thing. Whereas in HELP syndrome, you have predominantly hemorrhagic deposits of fibrin deposits around the porta hepatis. And there is also mitochondrial trifunctional protein defects in pregnancies compared with liver disease. So again, this was a Castro et al. Studied. This was again paper published in 2008, where the patient had reversible peripartum liver failure. A new perspective on diagnosis and cause of AFLP based on 28 consecutive cases. They again said that AFLP is a part of hypertensive spectrum, and HELP and AFLP are a single entity with gattal-startle features. So the common thing is both have vascular endothelial dysfunction. Both the disorders like severe preeclampsia, HELP syndrome, and AFLP, the common target is vascular endothelium, and it's a multi-system disorders. All the organs in the bodies are affected. Preeclampsia, hypertensive, basically genetic factors, environmental factors. Basically, it's more common in rainy season. That's what preeclampsia, and they have hepatic, renal, and CNS symptoms. So whenever we have a patient who presents with, our idea as a clinician is to identify the black sheep so that we can do a targeted therapy and appropriate intervention clearly and properly. So again, it's a very important because it is one of the commonest cause of retication in hypertensive disorders because of late diagnosis, misdiagnosis, preeclampsia, sitting on the patient, or thinking that it's a sepsis, giving antibiotics, and you delay in delivery, because one of the single most important factor of HELP AFLP is there is no expectant management. Once you diagnose, you have got, depending on the underlying condition of the mother, you have got 24 or 48 hours, but deliver the mother as soon as possible. So unlike sepsis where you control with antibiotics, there is no expectant management in HELP AFLP. Even in preeclampsia, if the blood pressure is stable, if the features are not severe, you can continue pregnancy with control of blood pressure. So expectant management is common in preeclampsia, but in HELP AFLP, there is no expectant management. At the most, you can delay by a few days for the steroid given for lung maturity, fetal lung maturity. So delayed delivery is only for buying some time, depending on the underlying medical condition, to give steroids for fetal lung maturity. Importantly, failure to recognize the complications are very important because these patients, once they progress to multi-organ dysfunction syndrome, it is catastrophic and very, very poor prognosis. So pinning down right diagnosis is very important. Again, in our country, where malaria, leptospira, dengue, the tropical diseases are common. You have HELP at one end, you have AFLP at one end. So you have infective causes, you have septic causes, you have underlying pregnancy-related causes. So the clinician should be very wise. You need to have a lot of experience to differentiate that this is a pregnancy-associated entity, and the only way to treatment is terminate the pregnancy. Whereas sepsis, hepatitis B or hepatitis E or hepatitis A, you can just continue supportive care. And they also mimic HELP, AFLP, but what they need is you give supportive care. There is no need to terminate. But how do you differentiate these clinical entities is comes from clinical experience, laboratory findings, and importantly, the wisdom of the clinician and the underlying team that takes care of the patient. So the best thing is have a healthy dose of suspicion and evaluate the patient. Is once you do a profile of investigation like LFTs, RFTs, coagulation, and complete blood count, peripheral smear, and I'll come to it a little later. Don't sit on this. These patients, they require repeated serial monitoring, because initial reports may be normal, the patient can progress rapidly. Suppose if the progression is slow, then unlikely that it is fulminant HELLP syndrome. It can be a low grade or incomplete HELLP syndrome. So healthy dose of suspicion and progress is what is important. Serial monitoring is what is paramount importance. Again, you have to remember that 30% of HELLP syndromes, they occur postpartum. So everything is hunky-dory, mother is delivered normally, no problems, everything is fine, doesn't mean good. She may come with a fit, or she may come with altered sensorium a week later, or 4 days later, within a week's time, with a seizure, and it can be postpartum HELLP syndrome, or it can be any other coincidental cause, sepsis, CSVT. You need to have an algorithmic approach. So 30% of patients with severe preeclampsia, or they have postpartum severe preeclampsia or postpartam HELLP syndrome. That's very important. So how does HELLP syndrome clinically present? As I said earlier, class 1 and class 2 HELLP, 60 to 70%, they have only biochemical derangement. 15% they don't have hypertension, they are normotensive. So again, this is a not a feature of preeclampsia. What is preeclampsia? Importantly, they may have mild flu-like symptom, and with the current COVID going on, you need to keep this as a differential diagnosis. Is it COVID? Is it HELP? Is it AFLP? Or is it H1N1? So you need to have a clinical symptomatology and algorithmic approach, so that every case is not COVID, every case is not HELP, and you need to strike a balance and take a call. But importantly, seizures and intracranial bleeds are very common, because sometimes they present with seizures, and hence it is of paramount importance that even patients with HELP syndrome with normal blood pressure, they require magnesium sulfate prophylaxis. If you see severe preeclampsia, if the BP is 160/100 well controlled, magnesium prophylaxis is not always indicated. But HELP syndrome, even if they have normotensive, anti-seizure prophylaxis with magnesium sulfate is of paramount importance. Further, the beauty of magnesium sulfate is it also helps in fetal neuroprotection. If at all the fetus which needs preterm delivery, it also acts as a neuroprotection for the fetus. If you look at the common signs and symptoms of HELP syndrome, hypertension is seen in about 85%. That 15% are that they do not have hypertension. Proteinuria is not always a feature. Right upper quadrant pain is one of the commonest signs. One of the 90% of women, they have right upper quadrant pain. Nausea, vomiting, again 30 to 80%. Headaches are not very common. Visual symptoms may occur in few. Mucosal bleeding and hematuria are quite rare, but yes, they are very late presentation. You don't have to wait for hematuria to occur or mucosal bleeds to occur. Again, the conditions that heighten the risk of HELP syndrome are basically preeclampsia, gestation hypertension, early onset hypertension, thrombophilias like any of those antithrombin 3 deficiencies, or secondary thrombophilia like systemic lupus erythematosus or APLA syndrome, abruptio placentae, non-specific viral syndrome symptoms, and persistent nausea, vomiting in third trimester. Basically, one of the things that you have to remember is HELP syndrome does not occur in first trimester, but there are few cases where HELP syndrome occurs in early second trimester, like around 23-24 weeks. But majority of the HELP syndrome, they occur in third trimester, and almost 95% of AFLP occurs in third trimester, around 34-35 weeks, not very rarely in second trimester. So these are basically seen exclusive in pregnant women pregnancy, and they occur in second and third trimester AFLP. Usually in third trimester, HELP may occur sometimes in around 20 to 23 weeks, also early onset HELP syndrome. The complications, as I said earlier, are massive. Like earlier in 1970s, 80s, and 90s, the death rate of AFLP was almost 80%, and health was almost about 40 to 50%. But currently, with the good critical care support and good multidisciplinary team support, the mortality of AFLP is less than 5%, and HELP syndrome is almost negligible. I would say less than 2%. More importantly, acute pancreatitis is one of the dreaded complications. For some reason, as I said, both HELP and AFLP, it's a multi-system disorder. The commonest systems that are involved are lung in terms of pulmonary edema, coagulation like DIC, liver, hepatic ischemia or rupture, kidneys causing acute kidney injury, brain causing seizures. But for some reason, pancreas, for some reason, are protected. But when pancreas are involved as a part of AFLP and HELP, the intensity of organ damage is very high. Like suppose if you have acute kidney injury without pancreatitis, most of them they recover without any dialysis. If you have ARDS or pulmonary edema without pancreatitis, most of them they recover with recover with NIV or short-term ventilation 24 to 48 hours. But if acute pancreatitis is there with acute kidney injury, pulmonary edema, the ARDS is quite severe. We have had cases where they end up with tracheostomy, long-term ventilation, where long-term dialysis almost taking 4 to 5 months to recover completely, and they end up with metal floor infarction. So acute pancreatitis is one of the feature of AFLP and HELP, and you need to keep a watch on it. So any patient who has persistent upper abdominal pain or persistent epigastric pain, it could be preeclampsia or a stretch of Gleason's capsule on the liver, but please keep your mind open. Think of pancreatitis and don't just diagnose as esophageal spasm or GERD or gastritis. Rule out pancreatitis. So AFLP, there are Swansea criteria, clinical evaluation, which again, vomiting, abdominal pain, polydipsia, polyuria, encephalopathy, and all those so on and so forth. But importantly, you have to remember that hypoglycemia is the hallmark of AFLP. Hypoglycemia, it is not common in HELP syndrome. Urea, creatinine, again, are deranged in both. But importantly, the elevated bilirubin is more than 8 or more than 10 in AFLP. Bilirubin is not that high in HELP syndrome, whereas here bilirubin is very high. LDH is predominantly elevated in HELP, whereas AFLP, you don't have. I'll come to the table a little later, but this is what you need to remember. And TLC is the total leukocyte count again is elevated in AFLP, not that elevated in HELP syndrome. So basically, diagnosing AFLP is decreasing glucose level, elevated AST, ALT, elevated alkaline phosphatase. Again, you need to not obstruct your surgical cause of jaundice when you have elevated alkaline phosphatase. Again, you have to remember that the upper limit of alkaline phosphatase in pregnancy is 350 units, not 100 units, which you see in non-pregnancy, because there is a placental origin of alkaline phosphatase as well. Again, creatinine is elevated more in AFLP, elevated lipase and amylase. Again, that indicates acute pancreatitis. Ammonia and hyperuricemia. Again, these are hallmark of AFLP. Ammonia may not be that elevated in HELP or even unlike sepsis. And if you do ultrasound of the abdomen, you have a bright liver, hyperechoic, and CT MRI shows hypotensive liver. Again, it's an indication of fatty deposits. So, rising serum creatinine may be the earliest biochemical indicator of AFLP, and some renal impairment is present in all cases of AFLP. So, whenever you have a patient with acute hepatic failure in pregnancy, is it pregnancy-related acute hepatic failure or coincidental to pregnancy, or it is underlying chronic liver disease with acute exacerbation? So you need to have wide differentials, and before jumping that it is AFLP. So you need to have an algorithmic approach for everything, and that's how you come to a diagnosis or linchpin the right diagnosis. So differential diagnosis of HELP AFLP complex is acute fatty liver of pregnancy, acute pancreatitis, APLA syndrome. It could be fulminant APLA syndrome or catastrophic APLA, cholecystitis, acute cholecystitis, disseminated herpes simplex, fulminant viral hepatitis A are actually very common in our country. B and C, most of the hospitals, they have a viral profile which HIV, HBsAg, and hepatitis C are routinely done. But hepatitis B infection sometimes can present with similar symptoms. HUS is common, especially HUS. Again, there are several types, but HUS with E. coli sepsis is quite common. And the hallmark is bilirubin is not that high, and they predominantly present with renal symptoms, and LDH is very, very high. Septic shock, immune thrombosis, ITP, and TTP, and other different other causes. But importantly, if you don't see improvement in platelets and HELLP syndrome or reversal of pathophysiology in AFLP after termination of pregnancy, think that sepsis has intervened and you need to step up the bio lab like aggressive lab workup in terms of procalcitonin in blood cultures, urine cultures, or find out the focus of sepsis and go for kill. So what is the appropriate workup when you have a patient with HELLP AFLP complex? Basically, we have devised a simple profile in our hospital, preeclampsia profile, which constitutes complete blood picture, peripheral smear, and platelet count. Peripheral smear basically to look at fragmented RBC, cystocytes, and burst cells, and thrombocytopenia, and complete urine examination, urine culture. Again, urosepsis is very common in pregnancy, so urine culture is part of a preeclampsia profile. RF is like creatinine, urea, and uric acid. Uric acid again is a fetal prognosticator, and of course not a prognosticator, but at least it indicates poor fetal prognosis if the uric acid is high. LFTs are common, like albumin is generally less than 3 acute phase reactant protein, but importantly, SGOT, SGPT, bilirubin are elevated, and depending on the underlying HELLP or AFLP, you have the subtle differences. And proteinuria may not always be present, but we also do 24 hours urinary protein and creatinine clearance or spot protein creatinine ratio. Once you have a basic preeclampsia profile in a patient who comes with hypertensive disorder, we need to, as I said, we need to follow them up serially. And doing preeclampsia profile every 6th hourly, 8th hourly becomes a very expensive affair because we are a private hospital and everything is paid by the patient. Insurance coverage is very poor. So we have devised a mini preeclampsia profile where we monitor a few parameters serially to see, look at the trend. So SGPT, LDH, platelets, and creatinine we monitor 6th hourly till we establish a trend for 24 to 48 hours. And after that, we do once, twice a week or once a week and then once in a fortnight. And that's how, if you are prolonging the pregnancy, if it is a preeclampsia or severe preeclampsia. Otherwise, within 48 hours, we terminate the pregnancy. But if the patient presents in a fulminant way, like late referrals who comes with preeclampsia, severe preeclampsia, or who comes with hematuria or bleeding gums, then straight away we jump to extended PE profile, which contains, in addition to all the things, of course, the preeclampsia profile also contains random glucose, but it also, that extended preeclampsia profile contains haptoglobulin and hemoglobinuria because the haptoglobulin levels are less in reduced in HELP and AFLP. Importantly, lipase, amylase, and electrolytes. Electrolytes are important from an anesthetic viewpoint because most of these patients that require termination of pregnancy, and majority of the time, as I said in my first slide, 98% or 99% of all elective procedures we do on a regional, and 96 to 97% emergency procedures, category, even category 1 section like stat cesarean sections, we do 50% under regional, but category 2 and 3 mostly are under regional anesthesia. So with that high rate of regional, very few general, this is one area where we require general anesthesia. And whenever we give general anesthesia, dexamethasone is the muscle relaxant of choice for modified rapid sequence intubation. And whenever you have acute kidney injury, you have hyperkalemia, and we know what happens when you give dexamethasone in hyperkalemia. So recent fresh electrolyte report before surgery is mandatory. Lipase ML is included in extended profile. Again, this is a hallmark of acute pancreatitis. And ABG with lactate. I'll tell you the relevance of ABG, and ultrasound abdomen is indicated because ultrasound abdomen helps us in identifying obstructive cause of jaundice or any tropical diseases which they have associated gallstones or splenomegaly and sickle cell disease, and all those things can be diagnosed. So the cataclysmal aspect of HELP AFLP complex is the speed of cascading events. I would say majority of the HELP syndromes, I would say about 70% to 80% of HELP syndromes are stable, relatively stable HELP syndrome, but 10 to 15% they progress very, very rapidly. Like within 4 hours, the preeclampsia profile may change from normal to completely abnormal. And if you wait for next samples to be sent after 12 hours, then you are in soup. So you need to see the clinical features and time the repeat sampling. Like generally we do to establish a trend every 6 hours, and once the trend is stable, then we extend it by 24 hours or every 48 hours. But if you miss out the speed of cascading events, we have had couple of cases we got in wrong foot, and we ended up with massive multi-organ failure within 12 hours of admission. At 12 hours before, it was a completely normal profile, and within 12 hours, it was a completely deranged profile with bilirubin from 2, with 1.2 going up to bilirubin of 14 and creatinine 0.8 jumping to 2, and so on and so forth. Every parameter got changed. So basically, we need to recognize this progress very, very rapidly, and you need to have some sort of rapid response team in the hospital where we have 24/7 coverage by anesthesiologist. We take care of intensive critical care unit, and this is where is of good ratio. We have a modified OPSIC early morning system. This was introduced in NHS in 2008, but we have modified at Fernandez Hospital certain parameters, and a serial monitoring of this also flags the patient appropriately, and we can catch the patient progression to fulminant HELP or AFLP with mild organ failure relatively early. So when you come to the management option of HELP AFLP complex, it's a multidisciplinary team approach. We need to optimize the patient, and we need to terminate the pregnancy. So basically, the multidisciplinary team approach is of paramount importance. You need to have an obstetrician who is the center, but I would say in complex high-risk cases, the anesthesiologist takes a lead because they manage the pain, they manage the critical care, and it is better they liaise with the different teams, the fetal medicine team, the obstetric medicine team, and maternal fetal medicine team, because the timing of delivery has to be decided, and timing of delivery is best decided by the joint decision, whereas we give 12 hours, we give 6 hours, we don't give any time, and this is very important. And importantly, we need to take input from neonatal team also, because they are ready with the ventilatory backup, with the resuscitation, with the CPAP or BiPAP at birth, and all those. Then importantly, the blood bank, because this patient may end up with major obstetric hemorrhage. I said 15% of HELP ALP, they end up with major hemorrhage and may require massive transfusion. So the treatment goals of HELP AFLP is call for help, senior help. When I say senior, experienced help. So the motto is to arrest the pathophysiology by terminating the pregnancy and reverse the pathophysiology and shorten the patient's progress to multi-organ dysfunction syndrome. So if it is a HELP syndrome, prevent the progression from class 2 to class 1 and MORS. And importantly, the perinatal mortality, maternal mortality, morbidity can be minimized by early intervention. And if you don't have facility at your hospital, the blood bank is not there, the multidisciplinary team is not there, do not handle this hot patient in your nursing home. Please transfer the patient early rather than transferring the patient with multi-organ failure, because if you end up in a bad foot if you don't transfer it timely. So if you don't have facility, please transfer the patient to a higher center which can cater to multidisciplinary like dialysis, ventilation, and sometimes liver transplantation team also has to be alerted. And currently, at least about 12 to 14 cities in India, they do liver transplantation, and we need to give at least, I would say, 0.2% of these patients may require liver transplantation. As I said earlier, there is no role of expectant management. At the most, we wait for steroid cover. So do not wait for hematuria to occur or cola urine to occur. We need to terminate the pregnancy early. So if you see the patient comes with oliguria, frank hematuria, and subsequently oliguria is corrected by judicious fluid management and invasive hemodynamic appropriate monitoring, and later on the patient starts diuresing. Of course, patient is still having jaundice and acute kidney injury, but still the output is important. So this is what is important. And you can see jaundice is persisting, but hematuria, coagulopathy is under control, hemolysis is under control. So this is the classic progression. That patient comes with oliguria, frank hematuria, hematuria worsens, you see typical cola urine, and you see the cola urine getting cleared, bilirubin is still persisting, and importantly, cola urine, the hemolysis decreases, and that is what is fulminant aggressive approach and reversing the patient back to normalcy. So the management goals is, as I said, most of these patients, they have underlying hypertension, so control of blood pressure is of paramount importance. Seizure prophylaxis. Seizure prophylaxis, as I said, magnesium sulfate is the drug of choice, and patients without hypertension also with the HELP syndrome, please give magnesium sulfate. The loading dose is 4 grams. That is 1 ampule is 50% magnesium sulfate, 2 ml, 1 gram in 1 ampule. So 4 ampules dilute with 12 ml of penicillin over 20 minutes. The loading dose followed by 1 gram per hour as an infusion. We give it as an infusion. If this patient has acute kidney injury and anuria, oliguria, you can still give the loading dose of magnesium sulfate, And later on, you can check the magnesium levels, and then you can repeat the dose, half dose or half maintenance, like 0.5 grams per hour. So it is very important to give seizure prophylaxis. You have to remember that magnesium is not an antihypertensive agent; it's an anti-seizure, seizure prevention, and also fetal neuroprotection. Intrapartum pain management, neuraxial analgesia, if there is no contraindication. There are a lot of issues about platelet thrombocytopenia, but in our hospital, the cutoff is 70,000. But again, we don't look at the absolute value. We look at the trend of platelets, and many a times 70 to 80,000 platelets are fine for giving a regional anesthesia for either labor epidural or cesarean section, spinal for cesarean section. But you have to remember that this 70,000 can become 30,000 in no time. So you need to remember the underlying dynamic pathophysiology. So if the patient requires cesarean section, you need to be ready with general anesthesia and post-op pain management, perioperative fluid management, emergencies like pulmonary edema, DIC mods, and monitoring and other things. So hypertensive crisis is of paramount importance. The commonest drug that we use is if a patient is alert, peroral nifedipine is a drug of choice, or intravenous labetalol can be given. But again, labetalol is relatively contraindicated if the patient has underlying cardiomyopathy, because hypertensive cardiomyopathy is sometimes common, and the moment you give labetalol, they go into florid pulmonary edema. So hydralazine then becomes a rescue drug in those cases. But anyway, nifedipine, hydralazine, labetalol, nifedipine is oral, plain nifedipine oral. There is no role of sublingual nifedipine, please. Transfer the patient to high dependence unit early, fundoscopy to be seen, deep tendon reflexes, GVP to be checked, prevent overshoot hypotension. Whenever you're giving antihypertensive, do not reduce the blood pressure, maternal blood pressure to less than 130/90. Let it be at least 130 to 140 systolic and 85 to 95 diastolic, not less than 80, not systolic, not less than 130. Because if you if the patient develops overshoot hypotension, there might be fetal placental blood flow is reduced, and you may see fetal distress, or you may end up with abnormal CTG. Serial monitoring of clinical and laboratory trend is of paramount importance. Again, as I said, magnesium sulfate is a drug of choice. Renal impairment, dose adjustments have to be, loading dose is same, but subsequent adjustment, instead of 1 gram, you give 0.5 grams. But check of serum magnesium is of paramount importance every 6 hours. But importantly, clinical parameters of magnesium levels like deep tendon reflexes, level of consciousness, respiratory rate, and urine output are very good clinical monitors. You don't have to check serum magnesium, but if the deep tendon reflexes are already blunted before loading dose, then yes, you need to check serum magnesium 6 to 8 hourly and appropriately titrate. But you have to remember that magnesium is excreted almost 99% with kidneys, and you see magnesium toxicity very, very rapidly in the presence of AKI. So you need to keep that in mind. So basically, if the patient throws repeat seizure, also you can repeat magnesium if the output is good. Planning delivery is of paramount importance. As I said, there is no expectant management, and correction of coagulopathy is of paramount importance before you deliver. Anticipate difficult intubation, anticipate major optic hemorrhage, avoid instrumental deliveries because sometimes HELP syndrome, the platelets, you see more trauma and more blood loss. Active management of third stage to minimize postpartum hemorrhage. Hematomas and post-op wound problems are very, very high. So again, most of the obstetricians, with due respects and regards, they have a very, very high threshold to put drains. So this is one area when the patients have low platelets or patient has underlying DIC, please request them to put wide bore drain in the abdomen behind the Douglas pouch of Douglas, and subfacial drain in the rectus sheath, so that you can prevent rectus sheath hematoma, you can prevent wound hematomas. And drains, yes, they are one of the cause for infection, but again, given a choice, because we manage the critical care unit, it is wiser to have drain in situ if the patient underlying DIC. And again, this is the clearing of hematuria, and this is what is important. Again, beware of this ecchymotic rash or petechial rash. So you need to see that the ambient light is good, and be vigilant of these marks on the thighs or the knees or the hands, and this indicates fulminant progress to disseminated intravascular coagulation. Again, our friend Dr. Bhavani Shankar Kodale did a study that airway changes during labor, airway changes during different trimesters, airway changes during labor. So Balampati grade 1 can become grade 4 as the labor progresses. So anticipate difficult intubation. More importantly, because of HELLP syndrome and because of AFLP, it's a low oncotic pressure state. There is endothelial edema, mucosal edema, and airway becomes difficult, and you end up with difficult intubation. So you need to have a difficult airway algorithm, trolley algorithm fixed in your brain. Plan A, Plan B, Plan Z. I said earlier that the role of ABGs is of paramount importance. In fact, we have found that at least about patients who have severe preeclampsia with oliguria, they have metabolic acidosis, severe metabolic acidosis. So, in fact, if you see, one of the earliest indication to terminate the pregnancy is not preeclampsia profile, but I would say ABG. If you see persistent metabolic acidosis, which is very high, more than -10, -12, up to -6 is normal in pregnancy. But anything more than that, it's an indication to terminate the pregnancy because it's an imminent acute kidney injury. This was a patient who came with pictures of HELLP syndrome with low PF ratios. And if you look at the blood gas, if you see, my colleague was there, and this blood gas was done at around in the night, actually, at admission. Yeah, 2205. You see pH 7.0 -21. We stabilized the mother, optimized, we did a cesarean secondary spinal anesthesia, and on 12th December, within 11 hours, if you see, pH returned back to 7.3 and base deficit improved to -7. And this is what the termination of pregnancy does. So blood gas is a boon in patient with severe preeclampsia, HELLP syndrome, because if you give GA for this patient will not recover from anesthesia, and it will be an anesthetic, or it will be attributed to anesthesia as a delayed recovery. Actual cause of delayed recovery is because of underlying metabolic acidosis. And metabolic acidosis is seen very commonly, especially if they have underlying oliguria. And whenever there is underlying oliguria, hyperkalemia is common, so you need to check potassium. In this case, of course, potassium was on the lower side, but hyperkalemia is very common. I'm sure that you must have encountered the situation of increased ascitic fluid in the peritoneal cavity when the surgeon is going in. And ascitic fluid should not be taken lightly because it indicates a low oncotic pressure state. And these patients who have ascites of more than 700 ml or more than 600 ml, they are a case of low oncotic pressure, and they develop acute pulmonary edema very, very early. So these patients, they require invasive central venous monitoring, and they require judicious fluid optimization. Otherwise, they end up with pulmonary edema. And this is just the colloid oncotic pressure. If you see in pregnancy, non-pregnancy, 27 millimeters of mercury. In pregnancy, it is reduced 22, and in postpartum state, it is around 15 millimeters of mercury. Peak reduction occurs, and the peak reduction occurs 24 to 48 hours later. So patient is at risk of pulmonary edema up to 2 to 3 days after a delivery. You have to keep this in mind. AFLP, as I said, can end up with acute hepatic failure, and this requires again a close liaison with the intensivist because they require management of cerebral edema, management of hypoglycemia, management of viscerocolitemia, management of hypothermia, and bleeding, hemorrhage, control of hypertension. So many things are there. So the best thing is the patient should be managed in ICU, delivered in ICU if the patient is unstable, especially if they are contemplating vaginal delivery, imminent vaginal delivery. So the ICU's dilemmas, whether operative or vaginal delivery, this decision has to be taken jointly. If the baby is IUD and it's about to deliver, on verge of delivery, the fetus vertex, sometimes the nature takes care, and the patient is about to expel, then yes, you need to be ready with your blood and blood components. But you have to remember that AFLP do not resolve prior to pregnancy. You need to remove the placenta to reverse AFLP. You need to remove placenta and fetus to reverse HELLP syndrome. Again, prophylaxis against postpartum hemorrhage. Postpartum hemorrhage is very common, and generally we tend to give 40 units of oxytocin in 500 ml of Ringerlact, or 1 liter Ringerlact, give 250 ml of power. That high volume may not be tolerated by these women who have low oncotic pressure, who are prone for pulmonary edema. So generally we give 20 units in 50 ml, run at about 5 to 10 units per hour, and use multi-pronged prophylaxis. Like generally we have a low threshold to use carboprostomethame intramuscularly. Again, when you are giving intramuscular injection, use a smallest gauge needle and apply pressure so that there is no intramuscular hematoma. Coming to post-operative analgesia, Generally, multimodal analgesia tab blocks are very, very useful. Neuraxel, if you are giving Neuraxel, give morphine, 150 to 200 micrograms. Respiratory depression is very rare. Again, post-patient control fentanyl analgesia. Avoid paracetamol if the enzymes are very high. Do not give paracetamol if the enzymes are very high, if the liver function tests are deteriorating. But if the LFTs are stabilized, enzyme trend is normal, then you can give paracetamol 20 milligrams per kg. Instead of reducing the dose of paracetamol, reduce the dose interval. Instead of QID, make it BD or make it TID. But if the enzymes are increasing and bilirubin is increasing, do not give paracetamol. Again, there are few interesting case reports where the patients have been managed as HELP syndrome, and later on they turned out to be concealed paracetamol overdose presenting as HELP syndrome. So you have to be beware. Generally, we don't see in our country a paracetamol overdose, but it's an over-the-counter drug, and in the UK and the West, they have the cotidramol is very common, and they take almost 8 to 10 grams per day for joint pains and various reasons. This is just a slide which shows the presence of drain. As I said, very, very important. Do not put suction drain in peritoneal cavity. Suction drain is only in the rectus sheath. Whereas peritoneal cavity, you need to have a wide bore, 20 or 32 French drain. And again, this is a hepatic liver rupture. Appropriate monitoring is of paramount importance. We have a low threshold to use arterial blood invasive arterial monitoring, but some cases we use flow track also, because they end up with massive transfusion. Acute kidney injury perioperatively is quite common, and 2% of cases we see cortical necrosis. In fact, we have had 2 cases where back to back in single month, where both the patients end up with renal transplant within 8 months of dialysis support. So renal replacement therapy is of paramount importance. What to start, SLED or HD or CRRT plasmapheresis? Generally, patients with HUS or TTP, they respond very well to plasmapheresis, but HELP syndrome, SLED and CRRT is common. But if you have a mixed features of HELP, AFLP or HUS, then better to benefit of not give plasmapheresis, because reversal is rapid with plasmapheresis. This is just the series of HELP with pancreatitis. This is not with pancreatitis. Basically, pancreatitis, we have had 32 cases. This basically HELP series, 226 cases of HELP syndrome. 3.1% of patients HELP syndrome develop acute pancreatitis. 96% of HELP did not require RRT. Most of the AKI, if they are non-oliguric, they recover with conservative management. And 76% of HELP with pancreatitis requires RRT. So pancreatitis is a very good marker for diagnosing long-term organ supports. Again, they have multiple. This is our series. Like in 3 patients died because of intracranial hemorrhage. All were referral cases, late referrals. Pulmonary edema, DIC warrants aggressive multi-organ support. Associated pancreatitis is a strong predictor of pulmonary TKI, and these patients require aggressive RRTs. Again, we had 27 cases of AFLP in 2007. We had 3 patients who died, 2 because of hemorrhage and 1 died because of refractory shock secondary to sepsis. Again, if you look at the literature, HELP mortality is quite high because of various reasons that I mentioned earlier. But AFLP metal mortality is 7 to 18% in this thing. Our mortality rate is almost, I would say, less than 5% in AFLP and less than 1% in HELP syndrome. Very, very rare. Recurrent HELP syndrome is very common, 20 to 70% LCHAR, especially if they have underlying LCHAR deficiency. So every case who has suspected AFLP, please take a skin tag. If it's IUD, you can take a skin, axillary skin, or a skin from sole of the fetus and some blood, 10 ml of blood from the demised fetus, and send it for genetic analysis. And simultaneously, you can also take a sample from the mother to look at maternal deficiency also, because if she may be a heterogeneous carrier. So it predicts the onset of LCHAR in subsequent pregnancies. Even HELP syndrome recurs in again subsequent pregnancies, and you need to keep in mind. A few cases, interesting cases. I think I've got another 6 minutes. This was a 26-year-old trainee, 32 weeks gestation, severe preeclampsia on nifedipine, referred from nearby district as a HELP syndrome. If you see deranged bilirubin, deranged liver enzymes, elevated LDH, and patient was in magnesium sulfate steroid cover. 6 hours later, decision was taken to give steroids, and PSC was advised. We came into picture few hours later. When PSC, we found that she was tachypneic, tachycardic, EF ratio was low, base deficit was -12. We immediately shifted her to ICU. Tachypnea worsened. We had to intubate the patient. Blood pressure was under control, but she rapidly desaturated. And there was no time for us to stabilize because we shifted this patient. The fetal heart became bad. She was around 32 weeks, and chest X-ray showed features of ARDS. Basically, she was in the HDU for almost 12 hours, and we came into picture just about an hour before this. So tachypnea is one thing which they don't monitor. This case was in 2004 or 2005 when Muse chart was not. After Muse chart, we don't have this. We have to wait this long. Fortunately, the baby needed ventilation, recovered. Mother also recovered after 5 days. But when we when we operated her, this is what we found on the tummy. You can see this fatty deposits like saponification of fat, which are the features of acute pancreatitis. This patient retonic PPH, Bielik suture was taken, and subsequently this patient developed acute pain abdomen. You can see ischemia of the uterus. We had to reopen her, remove the Bielik stitch, and ultimately the patient improved. But what I mean to say is pancreatitis is quite common, and subsequently we did a CT scan, a contrast CT also once she recovered from acute kidney injury, and you can see air bubbles. And necrotizing acute pancreatitis with HELLP syndrome, she recovered quite well. So the lessons that we learned from this case was epigastric pain have differential diagnosis pain beyond eclampsia. It could be eclampsia, imminent eclampsia, or acute gastritis. It could be esophageal spasm. It could be GERD. But important to rule out acute pancreatitis. This was another case, probably I think this was in 2017 or 2016. A twin patient with severe preeclampsia with HELLP syndrome, persistent epigastric pain, imminent eclampsia. A protocol was followed. Emergency section was done. Twin babies delivered. On the first post-op day, she woke up. We have a fast-track ERAS protocol in our hospital. The patient was made to walk in the morning, and she just fell unconscious, loss of consciousness, severely pale. They suspected surgical bleed, but abdomen was normal, like ultrasound lower abdomen was normal, and she was stabilized and shifted to our center. Like we take care of Century Hospital, which is again a level for obstetric critical care, and this is what is found. There is almost a large hematoma in the liver with a fracture of right lobe of liver. You can see segment 5, 6, 7, 8 segments of the liver are involved, and you can see the hematoma extending almost up to the left lower lobe. And patient, the surgical opinion wanted to be opened up, but we thought because we correct the coagulopathy and we followed the patient. This was in 2016, sorry. And after 6 months, there was significant reduction in previous subcapsular hematoma of the liver. So we managed conservatively, and she improved significantly. So we have had almost about 6 cases of massive liver hematomas in last 20 years, one mortality which we had explored, and the patient died. This was a paper from our center. Dr. Nusrat, one of the senior consultant, Fernandez, she presented a series of HELLP syndrome. The conclusion is 12.5% of severe preeclampsia had HELLP syndrome, 14.13% patient had renal impairment, 26.7% required ICU care, 17.8% required blood components, and perinatal mortality rate was high. What is the role of steroids in HELLP syndrome? We also did a prospective study of giving steroids. We found to be useless, and we abandoned the study after about 3 years. But in the recent literature, again, this was not a very recent, 2003, a SMASH study was reported seeking the mechanism of action for steroids in HELLP syndrome, and they found out that the the markers of predictors of severe preeclampsia, that SFLT1, S-endoglin, and interleukin 6, there was reduction by giving steroids, but so far they have not improved the maternal mortality, neither neonatal mortality or maternal fetal outcome. So steroid role is questionable. But yes, plasmapheresis is the intervention of choice if there is a element of doubt about thrombotic macroangiopathy like HUS or TTP. But if it is simple HELLP and AFLP related acute kidney injury, then simple dialysis may help. But if it is a thrombotic macroangiopathy, then plasma exchange is a intervention of choice. So whenever you have a patient with HELLP, AFLP complex, please have the differentials. The commonest differentials are thrombocytopenic purpura, hemorrhagic uremic syndrome, sepsis, leptospira, dengue, and it could be malaria also, like cerebral falciparum malaria. And all these things can have subtle features which can differentiate each from other, but it can be targeted individually. One of the important marker that is recently available in our hospital also, like AIG hospital, NMTS 13SA. Basically, this is again a disintegrated metalloproteinase with a thrombospondin, also known as bond relevant cleaving protease, which is deficient in patient with AFLP and HELP. So if you see this NMTS assays in TTPs and HUS, they reduce remarkably, whereas in HELP and AFLP, there is not much of reduction. So if you have this test, it is a good predictor of a differentiator between HELP, AFLP, and TTP and HUS. So basically, stumbling block for clinicians are confused clinical picture, delayed treatment initiation, late reference, and lack of incentive differentials. So have your differentials very, very clear. I end up my talk with this small case, which is very interesting case. Again, most of these interesting cases, they come on Sunday night when you have a relatively less experienced colleague on duty. These are the recent onset hypertension. This case came in 2017 and 2018 probably. On nifedipine labetalol, she was referred with recent onset preeclampsia with nifedipine labetalol, jaundice complicating pregnancy, and it was basically this was referred from Kurnool, recent just a district about 150 kilometers from Hyderabad, with HELP, LDH of 600 units. At arrival, patient was tachypneic, tachycardic. It was a Sunday evening at around 8:30. I got a call. Patient's HB is 6.8, TLC is 58,000. So my colleague was on duty, sir, it's a sepsis with HELP syndrome. We need to terminate the pregnancy. As I said, do a blood gas. Blood gas was not too bad. Then we did a procalcitonin. We have a point of care PCQ, PCTQ, and procalcitonin also was normal. So I was not, I was little worried about WBC count. We repeated it was still around 58,000. So I requested a pathologist to come and see the slide because I had a suspect, and this is what was seen. Can you identify? These are all the sicklers. So basically, it's a mimicker of HELP syndrome. So sickle cell with HELP syndrome. So patient had yes underlying HELP preeclampsia HELP syndrome, but it was a sickler that precipitated the sickle cell crisis, and she was acute chest syndrome. So imagine you are taking up a patient with acute chest syndrome, sickle cell crisis with HELP syndrome. You are in deep soup, deep trouble. So the reason for 58,000 count is the premature RBCs are thrown into circulation, and the nucleated RBCs are counted as WBCs by the Coulter, that automated counter. So you need to keep in mind that whenever the patient has comes from endemic area, she came from Kurnool near Adoni. She came from the endemic area. So you need to know the geography of her place where you're staying, what are the endemic areas of malaria, what are the endemic areas for dengue, and all those things, so that you can have a good differentials. Of course, we did a serious section under spinal, and this patient went home. So to conclude my talk on HELP AFLP, the clinical pulse or take-home message is understand the spectrum of hypertensive disorders. HELP and AFLP are considered as a spectrum of hypertensive disorders, and so recently HELP is an individual entity because it diverges from the pathophysiology of preeclampsia, and it helps. It's a severe inflammatory response activates C5 complements, and you can see the role of monoclonal antibody to halt or to arrest HELP syndrome. And there are subtle features HELP and AFLP you can differentiate. The hallmark of AFLP is hypoglycemia, leukocyte count is elevated, and enzymes are not that high. Enzymes are very high in HELP, and there are certain features which you can find in your chart, and you can put this chart in your labor room or the theater or PSC room so that you can differentiate. Early ABG, I would advise in all patients with preeclampsia, HELP and AFLP. ABG is a good predictor of post-operative ventilation. Have a low threshold to ventilate the patient if the patient has underlying metabolic acidosis. If you don't have facility to gather multidisciplinary team, please transfer this patient to a higher center. Categorize HELP syndrome in class 1, class 2, class 3. So basically prevent the progression of patient from class 1 to class 3 to class 1. E474Q mutation. Basically, this is again LCHAT deficiencies and fatty oxide oxidase dehydrogenase deficiency disorders, and you need to watch for in fetuses or the neonates who deliver with suspected AFLP or HELP syndrome, and so that prognosis in subsequent pregnancies and monitoring of mother becomes easy. Aggressive multi-organ support and organ protective strategies. Again, I would say we give lung protective ventilation for all GAs in pregnant women. It helps in recruitment of lung and also do lung recruitment maneuver. One other thing which I have to tell you is, if for some reason rocuronium is given instead of dexamethasone for hyperkalemia, I have seen that underlying HELP syndrome with acute kidney injury, deranged hepatic function, rocuronium ends up with postoperative ventilation. You cannot reverse this patient, and we have seen not one or two. Initially we thought probably we reversed the patient because the acidosis was corrected at the end of surgery, but both the patients had signs of delayed like inadequate reversal, and we had to ventilate this patient for 6 to 8 hours. So rocuronium, you have to be careful, and unless you have Sugamadex, better to ventilate the patient till the patient is completely out, and have a low threshold to ventilate the patient post-operatively. Have a wide differentials. Don't just say that this is HELP, this is AFLP. If generally most of the HELP and AFLP, after delivery of the fetus or the baby, within 4 days, the pathology reverses back to baseline. If the pathology do not reverse within 3 to 4 days, think, open up. Is it HUS? Is it TTP? Is it sepsis that is supervening and that is causing persistent thrombocytopenia or elevated liver enzymes? So differential should be continuously on your unit on the prowl. Anticipate and manage the complications. Prevent cerebral edema. If the patient has cerebral edema, electively ventilate, hyperventilate, and sometimes you may have to give a propped up position, Duphalac, and all those measures of acute liver failure, including NAC infusions. All those things have to be given. Steroids in HELP, no, but steroids for fetal lung maturity, yes. And expected management up to 48 hours if mother is stable. Plasmapheresis if it is postpartum thrombotic macroangiopathy, thrombotic thrombocytic purpura, or TMOF, that is thrombocytopenia associated multi-organ failure. This is one of my favorite slides. We do a very aggressive ventilatory support. If the patient has ARDS, we don't wean them off early. But yes, the moment we feel lungs are improving, we put them on, we extubate the patient, put them on NIV, and start metal bonding while the patient is ventilator support. Again, this we have found that from our own series of, there are several cases, the weaning is shortened by early feeding and the morale of the mother is boosted up. This was the case of HELP syndrome, again referred from nearby Azustic, and later on at the end of 48 hours there was absolutely no improvement in the, in fact the patient deteriorated, went into status epilepticus like syndrome, and we checked for malaria. It was the peripheral smear was loaded with falciparum malaria, so presented with ARDS. So basically hemolysis, elevated liver enzymes, thrombocytopenia need not always be HELP or AFLP. It is a wide spectrum. It could be infective causes, it could be thrombophilia causes, it could be systemic lupus erythematosus, it could be lupus crisis, it could be APLA crisis, it could be catastrophic APLA. So you need to have a very, very wide differentials. Common things are still common. Common things are still common. Uncommon things are uncommon. So you need to keep wide differentials in mind. These are my references. Again, as I said, Richard Lee, this was a recent paper up to date May 2020, and this was an article by Robin Russell which came in June 2020, and of course HELP syndrome paper, again Baha Sibai, again this was recently revised in 2020. Thank you very much for your patient hearing, and if there are any questions, I am ready to take any questions. Hetal, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, sir. Thank you for extension review on the HELP and AFLP, and sharing your wide knowledge with all of us. Sir, there are few questions like what is the message for freelancers? Freelancers don't get such cases in frequently. In fact, they get once or twice in lifetime, like FLP syndrome. So, what is the message for them? When to refer the patient? What is the symptom or investigation? When they must think of referring the patient to the higher center?
One of the things that should be universally practiced is any patient who has underlying hypertensive disorders, get a preeclampsia profile done. CBP, platelets, LFTs, RFTs, and electrolytes. And blood gases may not be there always, but at least if this profile is done, as I said, 60 to 70% of HELP syndromes are biochemical pickups. So if LFTs are normal, platelets are normal, enzymes are normal, fine, nothing to worry. And again, when I say this LFTs and the preeclampsia profile, it is better to do within 4 hours of anesthesia. Like many a times, the report comes 4 hours back before surgery, but the sample must have taken 12 hours back. So you need to look at the sampling time. The sampling time of the preeclampsia profile should be within preceding 4 to 6 hours of surgery. This is mandatory. And if there's any derangement, then of course yes.
Thank you, sir.
Definitely, if you don't have this facility, clinically, if the patient is stable, there is no preeclampsia signs, there are no imminent signs like epigastric pain or blurring of vision, or she's voiding good amount of urine, no ecchymosis, no thrombotic, ecchymosis or petechiae, or reflexes are not exaggerated, and voiding good amount of urine, then yes. And if you don't have even platelet count, a single shot spinal in experienced hand is safe in this circumstance, especially if it is an emergency cesarean section. Again, a word of caution. Many times in nursing home practice, every damn thing is emergency. So it is. I would request all my anesthesia colleague to categorize cesarean section into category 1, 2, 3, and 4. So you ask the patient, you ask the surgeon, like, madam, what category is this cesarean section? They say emergency hai. Madam, emergency what category? Category 1. So put down on PAC chart category 1 cesarean section taken up for surgery, you are safe legally. But if you say category 2, then wait for the platelet count to come.
Exactly, sir. I wanted to ask you, sir. I had a similar experience. Like I went to the nursing home, and surgeon was ready for CS. Patient had recent history of hypertension. Recently detected hypertension. Blood sample were sent. There were reports, but it was 8 days old. So I gave spinal, and when report came, I found that patient was in half. Patient had low platelet count. I gave her spinal. Luckily, nothing happened. But if something goes wrong, what happens?
Yeah, again, I would say this thrombocytopenia, even if you see, I was reading the review that came in June 2020, this month, and this came in current opinion anesthesia, and I was very keen to see what is the cutoff, is there any new guideline. So they have discussed extensively about thrombocytopenia and spinal. Again, they say more than 70,000 you are safe with spinal, and more than 90,000, 1 lakh you are safe with epidural also. Experienced and even epidural are safe with 70,000 platelet count. But less than 70,000, you are in the gray area. So between 50, there are a case series of 106 cases where they are given spinal between 52,000 or 48,000 to 70,000, and no cases of spinal hematomas were reported. So spinal hematomas in thrombocytopenia is very rare, but if you want to use as a guideline and safety, 70,000 is the cutoff. But whenever you are thinking about giving a needle in the back, you need to ask yourself few questions. What is the risk of spinal hematoma versus risk of intubation, difficult intubation, and aspiration? Suppose the patient is simple airway, fasting, Mallampati grade 1, good extension, and platelet count are 60,000, go for intubation. If platelet counts are 60,000 and patient is difficult intubation, recent full stomach, had a full meal about an hour back, even with 60,000, regional is safe. Now you have a patient with 75,000 platelet count and Mallampati grade 1 and fasting patient NBM, or 80,000 platelet, or I would say 90,000 platelet. So you can give spinal, but GA also is safer. So risk of spinal hematoma versus risk of difficult intubation, risk of aspiration, you have to weigh. And most of the risk of difficult intubation, as I said, obstetric incidence is 1 in 300, and majority of the time, you remember the slides of Dr. Amit Shah and Dr. Apex Petwa. Not only intubation, but extubation also is important. Airway edema is common, laryngeal edema is, and I have had several nightmares of glottic opening of less than 3 or 3.5 millimeters when we did direct video laryngoscopy, awake video laryngoscopy to see the glottis before we attempted. So you need to be very, very cautious. So whenever you are planning to give a regional in a patient with thrombocytopenia, risk of regional with spinal hematoma, risk of GA with aspiration, you need to weigh risk versus benefit and do what is good and document everything.
Right, sir. Thank you, sir. Now, last question. It is about gynecologist favorite antihypertensive drug is sublingual nifedipine. One of our member has asked why not sublingual nifedipine, sir.
See, if you
What
look
is
at
the
the
cause to avoid?
yeah, sublingual nifedipine, if you look at the
Yeah.
anxiety of the patient before surgery, she walks in from home or she's in the hospital and she is anxious. The moment she is anxious, there is a catecholamine surge, there is dryness in the mouth, and you give sometimes at induction glycopyrrolate or antihypertensive and anticholinergic agent that further causes dryness. So sublingual nifedipine, either you see all or none phenomena. Either you have no absorption of sublingual nifedipine or complete absorption, and complete absorption of nifedipine can cause profound persistent hypotension, which we don't want, because I don't want BP of 120, 80, 110, 70 in this patient. I want blood pressure of 130, 90 is good enough. So what we do in our hospital, and most of the protocols they say is per oral plain nifedipine 10 milligrams. The onset of action is within 45 minutes. Yes, it doesn't act rapidly. It takes about 45 minutes to 1 hour. You can give 10 milligrams of nifedipine every hourly till the blood pressure comes down to 130, 90. But importantly, if it is, that's why you have to remember that it is a hypertensive emergency or hypertensive urgency. So hypertensive crisis can be classified as urgent or emergent. If it is urgent, that means there is no end organ damage. There is no pulmonary edema, there are no seizures, there is no retinal detachment, there is no blurring of vision. So it is urgent and you have some time, you can give nifedipine. But if it's an emergent situation wherein you have pulmonary edema, you have seizures, you have blurring of vision, kidneys are gone, then this situation, you need to be emergent. Then oral nifedipine may not have role. You need to give intravenous labetalol, drug of choice. You can start with 20 milligrams, escalate to 40, you can go up to 80. But background, again, most of the anesthesiologists fortunately are used to ultrasound machines for regional blocks, but try to develop some basic skills of looking LV contractility and of the ventricle, because 7 to 10% of patients with hypertensive disorders of pregnancy, they have underlying cardiomyopathy. Ejection fraction is reduced. So such case, then IV labetalol may not be safe, in which case IV hydralazine. Again, I must tell you that IV hydralazine is easily available in all the medical stores, and I would request all the anesthesiologists who do obstetric practice, even nursing homes, carry them in with them. And it's not an expensive drug. I think it's about 45 rupees or less than 100 rupees each vial. The dose of IV hydralazine is 5 milligrams, small boluses. But again, if these patients, you have to remember that most of these patients with preeclampsia, their fluid volume is contracted. They are relatively hypovolemic, even though blood systemic vascular resistance is very high. So they may develop profound hypotension. So probably a cautious 10 ml per kg of normal saline bolus, 250 ml bolus, you can give, and then subsequently give this hydralazine, or you can give labetalol. And
Right, sir. Thank you, sir.
whenever you have to intubate this patient, always remember
Yes, sir.
that
Yes, sir.
do not discontinue magnesium sulfate. It is prudent that magnesium sulfate has to be continued at induction. At intubation, you can give another 1 gram of bolus to suppress the laryngosympathetic response. But at intubation, please use NTG or labetalol to suppress the laryngosympathetic response, because we have seen that blood pressure may shoot up to 230 to 40 and 120 diastole at intubation, which is not allowed, because patients may end up with ruptured vessels in the brain, which you may not notice. So it is wise to monitor the pupils before you induce, and intrapartum during surgery with your laryngoscope or with a pencil torch, keep checking the pupils of the patient, so that anisocoria is one of the signs of intracranial bleed. And if the patient has altered pupillary size at the end of surgery, do not reverse this patient. Shift this patient with tube to the radiologist suite for a CT scan to rule out any intracranial pathology. So control laryngosympathetic response. Generally, we use nitroglycerin as an infusion. It controls very rapidly, but again, it can cause profound hypotension. But short NTG for little while at intubation, extubation is not an issue.
Thank you, sir. One last question, that is off the topic question. I wanted to, sir, this was discussed on our forum. ECG is a simple, non-invasive investigation. So, what is your take on pre-op ECG in all obstetric patients? Electrocardiogram, sir.
Preoperative ECG as a part of all patients who have chronic hypertension, whose age is 35 years and above, whose BMI is more than 35, ECG is a protocol we do in all cases. But again, preoperative ECG may not give much signs and symptoms of any underlying problem. But yes, unexplained persistent tachycardia, T-wave inversions, ST depressions, if at all they occur, they might be a hallmark of underlying cardiovascular, peripartum cardiomyopathy or some cardiomyopathy. So, ECG may not be a good marker, but clinically, if you feel patient has persistent tachycardia or insidious onset of breathlessness or excessive weight gain in the recent past, then yes, get an echo done or put a probe on the precordium and get a LV conductivity sorted out. Again, if you see a lot of discussion on the forum whether to do a routine preoperative echo or not, if you given a choice, make it a habit to do for all cases. But again, we cannot give it a guideline because not many hospitals they have this facility of preoperative echo. But if the patient again is obese, is hypertensive, advanced maternal age, especially hypertension, and there is left ventricular hypertrophy, then better get an echo done. And ECG also, yes. Again, risk of...
Thank you, sir.
I didn't discuss much risk of pulmonary edema. See, if you have a severe preeclampsia with HELP syndrome and severe preeclampsia or superimposed preeclampsia and chronic hypertension. If you look at chronic hypertensive patient with superimposed preeclampsia, risk of pulmonary edema is 70% higher than without chronic hypertension because the left ventricular remodeling is relatively less. So I would say chronic hypertension patient with superimposed preeclampsia are very, very high risk for pulmonary edema, and you need to be careful during fluids administration. And generally for all HELP syndromes, if there is no blood loss, say 80 to 90 ml per kg, per hour is good enough.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much from all task member, and we will like to hear from you in future also. Again, thank you very much from all task members, sir.
Thank you, Heather, and thank you, Tas, for giving me this opportunity. Again, I thank EOA also because I represent EOA. I'm the president, by the way, not secretary. Yeah. So thank you all, and catch you up again sometime soon. Have a good evening.
Thank you, sir.